I'm honored by the opportunity to address you here today, and I want to thank all of you for being a part of this. And I want to thank Legatum for the Institute for helping to arrange this event, and of course Chatham House for hosting it. It's one of the leading think tanks in the world, and I'm excited to have an exchange with you about our common challenges. So one of my favorite parts about serving in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is having the opportunity to travel to different countries and meet people from around the world. And most of the nations I visited are strikingly different from my home country. They have different types of government, different cultures, different ways of life. But what I'm always struck by is that people everywhere want for their families what Americans want for theirs. Things like peace, security, prosperity, and perhaps most important, liberty. And though strides have been made in spreading these values in recent decades, sadly they remain a dream in many nations around the world. But in others, I see a long tradition of support and adherence to these ideals. The United Kingdom is one such country. And although our two nations may differ in some important regards, the partnership we've enjoyed has not developed by accident. It is developed due to our shared set of values and goals. I recently read about a Sunday morning service that Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt attended together aboard a British warship in 1941. Churchill was moved by the fundamental similarities between Americans and Britons. He said that among the Americans he observed, quote, the same language, the same hymns, and more or less the same ideals, unquote. These shared ideals go back through centuries of British tradition, dating back to the Magna Carta. In fact, at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., an original copy of the Magna Carta sits just steps away from our own Constitution. Americans and Britons have stood side by side for the last century because of our shared convictions that have united us around a common cause. And that cause is the defense of liberty and the spread of freedom around the world. Now, the partnership we've shared has been one of extraordinary consequence. It has liberated nations. It has relieved the suffering of millions. It has sparked the spread of liberty to new regions. No partnership in history has seen such influence. Certainly not such beneficial influence. The partnership is what brings me here today. I'd like to discuss what the United States and the United Kingdom have achieved together in the past, but also where our special relationship should go in the future, especially given recent developments in my country. Our achievements in the past were marked by our partnership's unique beginning. The colonies that would later become America were, of course, born largely out of the enterprise of the British. Despite these roots, we fought 2 wars against the Crown in a span of 40 years. But eventually, the animosity of our forebears grew into friendship. It quickly became clear to our respective countrymen, particularly as they entered the 20th century, that the fates of our nation were tied to the defense of liberty, and that standing together to defend this liberty was not only strategically important, but also morally prudent. Over the last century, our people stood together on multiple occasions to oppose the advancement of evil, perhaps most famously on the beaches of Normandy. In doing so, we protected not just ourselves, but the very survival of liberty itself. Together we served, in the famous phrase, as watchmen on the walls of world freedom. Together we won the Cold War and brought peace and prosperity to Europe, a project that continues to this day. Together we drove those that plotted the attacks of September 11, 2001 from Afghanistan, and in the years that followed, toppled a murderous dictator in Iraq. Together, even as we pursued victory on the battlefield, we built schools and created opportunities that did not exist before. Together we partnered to save millions of adults and children from the affliction of AIDS through innovative partnerships such as the Global Fund. But despite all of these vitally important achievements, many have begun to wonder whether things are changing. Many on both sides of the Atlantic have begun to question the future of our partnership in an increasingly complex world. In recent years, this skepticism has come in the form of growing doubt about whether America can still be counted on to contribute to our mutual security and to uphold an international order that reflects our interests and our ideals. Many look to the dysfunction of Washington and wonder how America could ever expect to lead the world when it can't seem to get its own affairs in order. Now, Americans are indeed deeply and passionately divided on many public policy issues. And from abroad, and even from within, the current state of my country's politics often looks chaotic and uncertain. And on matters such as our nation's role around the world, Democrats and Republicans appear equally uncertain about the best path forward. There are many factors that have led to the current tenor of debate in the United States. Americans are emerging from the most dramatic economic crisis in a generation, and many feel financially insecure. As the cost of living continues to rise, some feel trapped in jobs that do not pay enough to maintain a middle-class life. Many others feel that the cornerstone of what we call the American dream, the knowledge that your children will have the opportunity to achieve their dreams and live a better life than your own, many fear that this may be slipping out of reach. In the midst of this domestic economic insecurity, our people, like many of yours as well, are also weary from decades of global engagement. Many have lost loved ones in Afghanistan and Iraq and watch as those nations suffer setbacks. And they wonder if those sacrifices have been worth it. We send billions of dollars in aid to people around the world. And in turn, we watch as they celebrate our tragedies and burn our flag. And we mourn the murder of 4 of our diplomats in Benghazi, the very city in which we intervened to prevent mass murder. While we face all these challenges, our federal government is in the grip of gridlock, seemingly unwilling and unable to move forward to solve the problems before us. And so in the face of all these struggles that I've just described, I understand why so many at home and around the world fear that America's best days lie in her past. And yet I'm here to assure you that while the road before us will be long and difficult, our finest hour as a nation and as an alliance is yet to come. And I'm optimistic because my country, like yours, it's more than just a government. Both of our peoples express their differences loudly and passionately because they live in free societies. And political conflict is not the only product of our individual liberty. From this freedom also emerge movements that empower, ideas that inspire, and innovations that change the world. We've had debates about looming American decline for more than 6 decades. During the Cold War, some thought the Soviet Union was destined to be the preeminent global power. In the 1980s, it was Japan. Now we hear the same about China. This has led to declinist predictions about not just the United States, by the way, but also Europe, or even more broadly, our system of democratic capitalism. Many question whether industrialized democracies are past their primes. We hear a lot of the rise of the so-called BRICS, or the supposed success of managed capitalism, and wonder whether our system is too messy and dysfunctional to continue to create opportunity and spread prosperity for our people. But to paraphrase the American writer Mark Twain, reports of our demise are greatly exaggerated. Despite the prophets of decline, our fundamentals as democracies, they remain strong. You see our strength in the way the rise of prosperity across the globe is creating demand for the innovations of our people. Our countries remain engines of the global economy, and the entrepreneurial spirit will continue to make us competitive, even as China's economy grows. You see the strength of America in the fact that, despite our fiscal debates back home, the US dollar remains the world's premier reserve currency. And despite those in China who talk about a de-Americanized world, foreign investors know that America is still the safest financial bet. Those in the United Kingdom understand that as well, given that Britain remains our largest foreign investor. You see it in the innovations that have recently transformed America into the world's greatest producer of oil and natural gas, creating new hubs of regional prosperity along the way. The United States is on track to becoming the world's largest oil producer by the year 2016, and an energy-sufficient nation by the year 2035. As Europe begins to explore its own shale gas revolution, there is potential for similar developments here as well. You see the strength of our nations and the resilience and might of our militaries. Despite the budget cuts that have been imposed in America, we respond more swiftly and effectively to crisis than any other nation, as we have witnessed recently in the Philippines When problems arise that require global attention, we do not circle the wagons and take cover. We roll up our sleeves and we get to work to find solutions. And when necessary, our brave men and women in uniform, they remain willing to sacrifice their safety and even their lives for the cause of freedom and liberty. So given all this, you may ask yourself, if neither America nor Britain are fading from the scene anytime soon, what does this mean for the world? What is the agenda for our work together in the years to come? Some may question, given that Europe is largely free and at peace, whether there is more we need to do together at all. But work will always remain for the cause of freedom. We need to be clear-eyed and realistic about the threats we face as an alliance, threats that in some ways are just as profound as those of the last century. We are witnessing an attack on our shared values. Rivals question whether our economies and our systems of government remain viable in this competitive world. We still confront a serious challenge from radical Islam and its tool of global terror. We face continued instability in the Middle East and Asia, as well as increasing uncertainty in the Middle East and Africa, as well as increasing uncertainty in Asia. And to meet these challenges, we need to first build on the success of our Transatlantic alliance. We should continue adapting NATO to meet new threats from rogue states and jihadists. And we must leverage our partnership to confront uncertainty in the Middle East and Asia, as well as to promote the promises of our values in Africa and in Latin America. We've achieved quite a bit since the end of the Cold War, but we need to continue to extend the influence that European institutions have had on Europe's periphery. Part of this involves being blunt about our differences with Vladimir Putin, differences with his government, not differences with his people, and reassuring our allies in the region that we support their ambitions to move forward toward liberty rather than backwards towards the days of Soviet domination. Many of these allies face ongoing threats to their territorial integrity, including in the new realms such as cyberspace. We also need to ensure that those on Europe's periphery who still desire to join the Western community of democracies retain the option if they meet the entry requirements. In particular, the United States needs to continue to work closely with the EU to bring Ukraine into the Western fold. We should all be concerned about the Ukrainian government's recent decision to bow to Russian pressure and not sign an association agreement or free trade pact with the EU. Our thoughts are with the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have taken to the streets to express concern about the future of their country. I share the views of the Swedish Foreign Minister, Carl Bildt, who recently said of the Ukraine that, quote, "They are not going west. I don't think they are going east. I feel they are going down," end quote. The United States needs a strong European Union that continues to be a stabilizing force on the continent, but also an effective partner on key international issues. As for Britain's role in Europe, that should be a matter for the British people to decide, and for your American partners to respect whatever decision you make. Our alliance, our partnership, and our affection for your nation will continue regardless of the road you choose. One of the key components of our unshakable alliance is NATO, as I mentioned earlier, and it remains relevant to the changing strategic landscape. The alliance has played an enormously important role in extending our shared values and solidifying peace and security in Europe. But in the last 15 years, we have also gone to war together 3 times, in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, and Libya, a development likely never envisioned by NATO's founders in 1949, when Soviet aggression posed the biggest threat to our mutual security. Now, not all allies look back at these operations through the same lens, but we need to recognize that these conflicts serve as illustrations of the fact that threats to our mutual security still exist, more than 2 decades after the end of the Cold War. Even as our joint mission in Afghanistan transitions to a new phase, we must focus on confronting new and emerging threats. Cooperation on challenges such as missile defense and threats emanating from the cyber realm are important, but not sufficient to ensure the long-term viability of our alliance. We need to explore ways that NATO can prepare for its future missions. For instance, despite the sacrifices borne by many allies in Afghanistan, Our military has gained valuable experience in coalition warfare. We should determine how these capabilities can continue to be relevant in the future. We must also be frank about where we can improve our efforts. Most can agree that the operation in Libya, for example, shouldn't have turned into such a difficult effort for the alliance. We should determine the best ways to apply the lessons we learned from this operation to future efforts. We must also examine how our failure to provide support to the pro-Western government that followed Gaddafi's ouster contributed to the current instability in that country today. Each of our nations must also rethink our approach to defense spending. We both face significant budgetary issues, but we must ensure that we do not repeat the mistakes that followed the First World War and then the Cold War, when we assumed we could cut back on our security in the hope of a peace that never materialized. In addition to our work through institutions such as NATO and the EU, we need to capitalize on the already deep economic ties between our two countries. An important first step is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Both of our countries should give this agreement the special attention it deserves, because if successful, TTIP will create one of the largest regional economies in the world. It will also help bring new prosperity to both the United States and Europe, providing a tangible benefit of our partnership to our citizens. Even as we work on TTIP, we should redouble our efforts to reduce global trade barriers. I am hopeful that at the conference beginning in Bali today, we can overcome differences and move towards the first global trade agreement of the 21st century. We should not limit our efforts to just these trade agreements. For example, right now, the United States is experiencing a shale revolution in oil and natural gas that has made our country a net energy exporter for the first time in 60 years. We must work together to ensure that this geopolitical opportunity is used to the advantage of our long-standing allies by expediting reviews of our export permits. Additionally, recent accusations regarding intelligence programs must not be allowed to poison our ability to work together. Cooperation between our two countries in this realm has been a pillar of the post-war alliance. As I said recently in a speech in Washington, our citizens' rights to privacy should be respected. But those who wish to do us harm, they don't use carrier pigeons to communicate. They use cell phones and the internet. And we need to be able to understand what those who threaten us are planning, while still operating within the confines of our respective legal systems. But we can't deal with these threats by focusing solely within our borders. We must understand that in this globalized world, whether it's disillusioned homegrown terrorists or someone propagating hate from overseas, these problems will eventually threaten all of us if left unaddressed. Tragically, this is a reality you have experienced in this city on several occasions. Our cooperation is especially important in a Middle East that's currently going through a fundamental transformation. And it provides us with great opportunities, but also with the potential for great peril. Europe and the United States should work more closely together on tasks, such as shepherding Egypt's transition to democracy or helping Tunisia and Libya provide benefits of their newfound freedom to their citizens. We must find ways to alleviate the human suffering of the Syrian people and work to build up elements of the moderate opposition. It should be a priority to ensure that the ongoing civil war does not create further regional instability or provide a new safe haven for al-Qaeda affiliates that will one day turn their attentions toward us. Similarly, the growing threat from Iran threatens regional stability and global security. It is vitally important that we work together to alleviate the concerns of our partners in the region, many of whom remain unconvinced that we should trust the commitments of a regime that sponsors terrorism, represses its people, and aims its verbal and political firepower at Israel, at America, and Europe. Now, I am personally skeptical of the interim agreement that the P5+1 have concluded with Iran. I am convinced that Iran's ultimate goals for these negotiations has been to achieve relief from the pressures of international sanctions while retaining the option of developing a nuclear weapon. This model has been used by others in the past, such as North Korea, to successfully exploit talks to create the time and space to eventually go nuclear. In Asia, the world's most populous region, so much depends on our efforts to ensure that China's rise remains peaceful. There are increasing signs that this may be easier said than done, including China's recent declaration of an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. This recent action by Beijing is an example of an issue on which it would be ideal to have America and Europe in lockstep, making clear to Beijing that freedom of flight in the region should not be held hostage to political agendas. America is currently engaged, at least rhetorically, in a rebalance to Asia. Despite this, a renewed U.S. focus on this strategically vital region cannot and should not and does not have to come at the expense of our transatlantic commitments. Given the values that we share and our history of facing new challenges together, I believe there is little we can do effectively in Asia without Britain and our European allies by our side. After all, your future will be just as dependent on what happens in that region as ours will be. In Asia and beyond, we must continue our cooperation in speaking out on behalf of those who cannot. Both of our nations have long histories as supporters and defenders of human rights. Margaret Thatcher was a voice for those in the Soviet Union who were repressed by the Kremlin. She noted that we in the West should not only be concerned about such actions as a humanitarian issue, but also as a global security issue. As she put it, quote, "A nation that denies those freedoms to its own people will have few scruples in denying them to others," unquote. This remains as true today as it was 30 years ago. Unfortunately, one need not look far to see gross human rights violations, whether in Russia or China or Cuba or Iran or North Korea, just to name a few. This, by the way, includes the rising persecution of religious minorities, especially Christians, for doing little more than practicing their faith. When the United States and Britain speak out together about these acts, our message is amplified, and our case is stronger than when either stands alone. I am convinced that the people of our nations understand this. And so whether it is strengthening the transatlantic alliance, confronting challenges in the Middle East, engaging in Asia, or standing up for the values that our countries hold dear, I remain confident that the United States and the United Kingdom will continue to work hand in hand as we did in the last century. Because the fact is, we must. If we do not stand together for liberty and freedom, and instead allow our historic partnership to fade into history, an enormous vacuum will open up. And imagine the forces of darkness and evil that would gladly move in to fill the void. Our two nations still have a common challenge, and I believe a common destiny. Now, it's also true that in America we have some work to do. Many of our political leaders are still hoping that our budget balances itself. Many hope that they can force their political opponents to adopt their agenda in its totality. They hope that America can simply look inward and ignore the global challenges of our time. It is human nature to wish for the challenges before you to resolve themselves, or to wish that they could be handled easily with minimal sacrifice. But earlier generations have left us with a common charge. In this city, in Grosvenor Square, in front of our embassy, there's a statue of Ronald Reagan with a quote from his first inaugural address. The quote says, "No arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women." End quote. Well, we, Americans and Britons, are descendants of men and women who took great risk and faced great challenges in the pursuit of liberty. And that is why each time our alliance has been confronted with a test, we have risen to meet it. Together we can continue to meet the world's challenges. We cannot rest, because those who oppose liberty will not rest. We will always have critics who predict that the end of this truly special relationship is near. that Britain and the United States have both had their days in the sun, and that the world's attention is shifting elsewhere. But they underestimate the power of our nations and the power of our shared values. They underestimate what we have and can achieve together. And more importantly, they underestimate the will and the moral courage of free men and women. In the end, I believe with all my heart that freedom will triumph in this world. I am sure of that, just as I am sure that it will be the United States and the United Kingdom working together to lead the way. So that's why I stand before you optimistic. Optimistic about where America is headed, and where we, working together with our European allies, will be able to take the ideals of freedom, economic opportunity, and human rights. Together, we will be able to respond to the challenges of the 21st century, just as our forebears faced those of the last. And when we do, our children will inherit a world better than the one that was left for us. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.